Hello and welcome to another episode of Working with Wisej. I'm Joe from iceteagroup, and in this video I would like to show you a little application that generates SQL statements and model classes. So without further ado, let's get started. As you can see, I have already loaded the SQL Tools solution, and to get started, we'll run the application so you have an impression of how it looks like. So let's start from the top left. Here I have the local database server, which is a Microsoft SQL Server. And in this database, we have several databases. And in this special database, we have a couple of tables. So whenever I change the database name, the list of tables changes. And whenever I change the selected table, the list of columns change. Here we have all columns selected, and on the right you see a SQL statement, an update statement, and an insert statement. On the bottom you see all the statements above, but formatted so that you can easily copy them to the clipboard and insert them into your code in case you need it there. Okay, the statements itself can be formatted in various ways. First of all, we can use a table alias. In this special example, right now we have the table name rights, and we, for example, might want to call this table simply R. So this is dynamically updated, so the table name has an alias now. This applies only to select statements because this doesn't make sense on the other statements. So what we have here is 4 fields in one row. Now if I reduce the number of fields per line by 1, it's still 4. All 4 are displayed. When I go down to 3, we have the line wrapped to a new line. And if I go further down, I can go down to 1. So there's only 1 field in one line. This makes sense if you have tables like, for example, this one, to have a certain number of fields and have a line break then. This makes the code more readable and it doesn't go out of the window on the right. Okay, so that's let's go back to a simple table. So that's the alias and the number of fields per line. We can also have the fields and the tables enclosed in square brackets. You see at each field is enclosed in square brackets and also table name and the alias. This applies also to update and insert statements, of course. Then we have the qualified names checkbox. The qualified names checkbox applies only to select statements, and it precedes the field names with the name of the alias. If there is no alias, it uses the table name. Okay, and last but not least, we have the field aliases. A field alias is a unique name of the field. This is especially useful when you have joins with several tables and identical field names in various tables. So it might happen that you have an ID in one table, an ID field in a different table. You want to join these, then you can explicitly name or provide an alias for each field, and this has to be unique. In this case, it's the unique name is constructed out of the field name, the table name, and an underscore between them. If I have an alias, it uses the alias. And of course, this can also be qualified names and also everything included in square brackets. Okay, that's so far everything for the SQL statements. Now let's go to the code generator. The code generator creates a model class. Let's start with the simple one. It has, of course, a namespace. It generates a class out of this table. The class name is usually given in a singular, while the table name has an S at the end, which indicates that this is a plural. Now you can change the namespace, for example, to SQL Tools, and this changes, of course, the namespace here. Then you can use attributes, which I needed in a project. You might not need it, so this can be switched on and off. First of all, here's the correct name of the table, because the class only has a singular, but the table is in plural. The attributes definition itself is right here. Here's the table name attribute. It simply holds the name. And we also have the primary key attribute. The other attributes are not used at the moment. And whenever I check use attributes, the attributes classes tab appears. If I uncheck, the tab is hidden. Then there's another thing called iNotify property changed. This is an implementation of the iNotify property change handler. There is another video. Check our channel for an explanation of how this works. I won't go into details here. But the base model that every class is derived from is also included here. So this can all be copied and pasted. Okay, so far that's all for the application. You know how it looks like, you know how it works, you know the opportunities you have when handling this. So let's dive a little bit into the code. First of all, we have the main page. The main page has a constructor which hooks up several controls of the form to a shared changed event handler. Let's go to the shared changed event handler. This does nothing but generate code or SQL. Now let's go to generate. Depending on which tab is selected, let's look at the form to see what the tabs are. We have one tab and we have a different tab. Okay. So depending on which tab is selected, either a SQL statement or the model code are generated. Okay, let's go back to the constructor. All these are hooked up, and whenever something changes here, the SQL statements and the model code are updated. Then we have several methods that load data. Let's start with load databases. First of all the data in the various controls is cleared, so we do not have any junk there after we have changed the database. The database names combo box is set to load database names, which returns a list of databases as a string. We'll get to this later. And if we have databases, then the first one is selected. Load tables also clears several controls, but of course not the database combo box, because that is probably already set at this point. If there is no database set at all, it does not load anything. But when there is a database entered, then we can load the table names from the database and put them into a list box on the left. That's the list box on the left. This is the combo box for the database, and this is the list box for the tables. Okay, whenever a table is selected, we'll have to load the columns. First of all, everything is cleared in the list view. Let's go back to the design. I'm talking about this one, which is a list view with several columns and the view is details. Okay, back to the main page. Loading columns means if there is no table name selected, we cannot do anything. But if it's selected, we load the columns. And the columns are now in a list, and we'll loop over the list and create list view items and also select them. A little specialty here is that I'm using the items user data, which is a unique feature of Wisej. Every control and, for example, list view items has the user data property, which can be created by simply assigning it to a dynamic variable, and this dynamic variable now creates a column field, and the column itself that we got from the database is stored here. So later on, when we have to generate code, the application can check the selected columns, and so later on, when we have to generate code, the application can ask the list view which are the selected list view items, and from the user data, it knows the according database columns. Okay, here we have a little helper method that retrieves all selected items from the list view, the column list view, and extracts the database column from the user data, adds them to the list, and returns the list. This does basically the same, but it does not use the selected items, but all items of the list view. Okay, you have already seen the generate method. Depending on which tab is selected, it generates either SQL or models. And the generate SQL statements method collects all the database columns that are stored in the list view with the columns, and then it calls SQL Generator, generates select, update, and insert statements, and puts them into a text box which is set to multi-line text, basic memo box. The model code does the same, basically the same, but it uses the model generator class to generate the code. All these generate methods receive some parameters which are flags. For example, the generate select receives not only the column list, but also how many fields per line are requested, which are the table and the alias names, qualified names, and so on. Okay, so here's just a little helper method. It's not important. When the application loads, the main page load event fires, and it loads the database that are included in this server. When the server name changes, it loads the database. When the database changes, it loads the table. And if the selected table changes, it loads the columns. And as soon as the columns are loaded, the generate method can be called. Then whenever a flag or fields per line is changed, it also calls the generate method. So on every change, all the code and the SQL statements are generated on the fly. Okay, that's all for the main page. Now let's go to some other classes that are included here. First of all, the DB column class. This is a very simple class that only holds some data from the database. The only interesting thing here is a property that maps SQL types to C# types. This is used for generating models. Okay, that was DB column. Now let's go to DB primary column. That's even simpler. It only holds a name and a table name and which column is a primary key. So whenever we generate SQL statements or models, we can either exclude these columns from the update list, or in the model class, we can append some attributes, for example, the PK attribute. So that was easy so far. Now let's go to the database. The database, of course, will need a connection. And everything else in this class is loading various things, like, for example, the names of the databases. So in this case, it opens connection that does not specify any database, and the list of database is extracted from the master database. This is very specific. Everything in this class is specific to Microsoft SQL Server, which is the only brand of SQL Server that is supported right now. Okay, load table names is almost the same. The difference is just that it needs a server and database name to select the tables also from the information schema. Loading the columns is a little bit more complicated. I'm using a data reader here. Accessing the other databases is done using a Dapper, which must have been installed using NuGet. Okay, so let's continue with the load columns. First of all, we get a connection, then we read the primary key columns. We create a new list of type DB column, which is also the return type. Then we have a SQL statement that reads everything from the information schema that has to do with columns for this specific table, of course. We execute a reader, and each row of this columns table is converted into a DB column and added to the resulting list. You remember the DB column was a class, and in this class we store name, type, length, is it required, is it a primary key, and it can also convert to C#. Okay, then we have the load primary key columns method. This method creates a list of DB primary key columns. All this is extracted from the information schema. I won't go into the details of how to read things from the database in terms of information schema. That's a whole different topic. And it's pretty good documented. You can browse Microsoft's knowledge base or simply Google for that. Okay, so when I collapse all definitions, I see I have just a method for getting a new connection. I'm loading databases, tables, columns, and primary key columns. All these are used in the main page, and whenever you decide to adapt this to Oracle or MySQL or whatever, you have to exchange this code to specific code for your database. Everything else is not database related in this application. Okay, we don't need this anymore. What else do we have? We have the SQL Generator Class. The SQL Generator Class has a couple of methods. First of all, generate select, generate update, and generate insert, and some helper methods. Then we have a helper function that simply adds brackets to a value if the flag is set. And getting a list of fields means we receive the column list of columns, and return a list of column names. Okay, now let's go to generate select. This is a little bit complicated in terms of string handling. It sums up various things to generate a SQL select statement. I won't go into details here, but if you want to know more, you can examine the code yourself. The same applies to generate update and generate insert. These are much simpler because it's just a field list with fields and values, and these are inserted into a template, and that's all. Okay, that's the SQL generator. Now let's move over to the model generator. The model generator is being called from the main page, which calls generate code. It receives all columns of the currently selected table. It receives the table name. The namespace can be entered manually. These are the flags that can be set using the checkboxes. Okay, the column list cannot be null. The table name is also required. So if the user chooses to implement the property changed interface, then generate property change is called. Otherwise, generate standard is called. Generate standard simply generates a namespace line, the class name, loops over all columns, and generates column declarations. The generate property changed is a little bit more complicated. It basically generates the same header, but this time the base model is included and the properties are declared differently. As I mentioned earlier, the implementation of base model and how this is handled and what it all means is already explained in a different video. Here's a little function that creates a singular out of plural value. Okay, so that's pretty much everything. We also have in this solution only these 3 images, which are used in the main page, like here. The themes are set using web.config. In my case, I chose the Clear 3 theme, but you can also choose different themes. Which ones are available, you can see in the designer. Okay, so that's pretty much all. Stay tuned for this application to appear on GitHub in our example page. We'll include a link in the description below. So I hope you liked this one. Use it if you find it useful. And so see you next time. Bye-bye.